The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as recruits lined up for their daily physical training session. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a 24-year-old woman whose quiet demeanor often made her blend into the background. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a regulation ponytail, and her uniform hung loosely on her slight frame. To most of her fellow soldiers, she appeared unremarkable, just another face in the crowd of eager recruits trying to prove themselves worthy of serving their country. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had been drilling soldiers for over 15 years, and he prided himself on his ability to spot weakness from a mile away. His weathered face bore the stern expression of a man who had seen countless recruits come and go, some rising to the challenge while others crumbled under pressure. As he surveyed the line of soldiers, his eyes settled on Sarah, and immediately his jaw tightened with disapproval. The physical training session was scheduled to begin with a grueling obstacle course, followed by a 5-mile run through the desert terrain surrounding their base in Nevada. The temperature was already climbing toward what would become another scorching day, with the mercury expected to reach well over 100 degrees by noon. For seasoned soldiers, this was just another Tuesday, but for the newer recruits, it represented yet another test of their commitment and endurance. Sarah stood silently as Sergeant Thompson barked out instructions, his voice carrying across the training ground with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The other soldiers around her shifted nervously, some stretching their muscles in preparation for the physical demands ahead, others checking their equipment one final time. The air was thick with anticipation and the underlying tension that always accompanied these training exercises. When Thompson finished his briefing and ordered the soldiers to begin their warm-up exercises, Sarah remained motionless. Her hands hung at her sides, and she made no move to join the jumping jacks and stretching routines that her fellow recruits had begun. Several soldiers glanced in her direction, confusion evident on their faces, as they wondered why she was not participating in what was clearly a mandatory activity. Thompson noticed her lack of movement almost immediately. His eyes narrowed as he strode across the dusty ground toward her, his heavy boots leaving distinct impressions in the sand. The sound of his approach caused nearby soldiers to pause in their exercises, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. The sergeant's reputation for dealing harshly with insubordination was well known throughout the base, and everyone present understood that Sarah was about to face the full force of his displeasure. When Thompson reached Sarah, he stopped directly in front of her, his imposing 6'3" frame towering over her more modest height. His face was flushed red from the morning heat and his growing anger, and the veins in his neck stood out prominently as he struggled to contain his temper. The silence stretched between them for several long seconds, broken only by the distant sounds of other soldiers continuing their exercises and the occasional call of a desert bird. Sarah looked up at the sergeant with steady eyes, showing no sign of the fear or nervousness that typically accompanied such confrontations. Her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Thompson's irritation, as he was accustomed to intimidating recruits into immediate compliance. The fact that this slight woman seemed completely unaffected by his presence struck him as either remarkable courage or dangerous defiance. Thompson's voice cracked like a whip across the training ground as he demanded to know why Sarah was not participating in the mandatory physical training. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, and every soldier within earshot turned their attention to the unfolding confrontation. The sergeant's question hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone present understood that Sarah's response would likely determine the course of her military career. Sarah's reply was delivered in a voice so quiet that Thompson had to lean forward to hear her clearly. She explained that she would not be participating in physical training that day due to a medical condition that prevented her from engaging in strenuous physical activity. Her words were carefully chosen and delivered with a respect for military protocol, but they clearly indicated that she had no intention of joining the exercise regardless of any orders she might receive. The sergeant's reaction was immediate and explosive. His face turned an even deeper shade of red as he processed what he considered to be an inexcusable attempt to avoid duty. In his 15 years of military service, he had heard countless excuses from soldiers trying to escape difficult training, and he was convinced that Sarah's claim was just another elaborate lie designed to get her out of hard work. Thompson's voice rose to a roar as he berated Sarah in front of the entire training group. He accused her of being weak, lazy, and fundamentally unsuited for military service. His words were harsh and personal, designed not just to express his disapproval, but to shame her into compliance. The other soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence, some feeling sympathy for Sarah, while others wondered if perhaps the sergeant was right about her commitment to service. The sergeant continued his verbal assault, suggesting that Sarah had probably invented some imaginary ailment to avoid sweating like the rest of the soldiers. He questioned her dedication to her country and fellow service members, implying that anyone who would try to escape physical training on such a flimsy pretext had no business wearing a military uniform. His words carried the sting of public humiliation, delivered in front of people who would be Sarah's colleagues for months or years to come. As Thompson's tirade continued, he began to mock the very idea that a young, apparently healthy woman could have any legitimate medical reason for avoiding physical exercise. He suggested that perhaps she was afraid of breaking a nail or messing up her hair, comments that drew nervous laughter from some of the male recruits who were eager to stay on the sergeant's good side. His mockery grew more pointed and personal, attacking not just Sarah's excuse, but her character and motivations. Sarah endured the verbal assault with remarkable composure, never raising her voice or responding in kind to the sergeant's increasingly personal attacks. Her silence seemed to infuriate Thompson even more, as he interpreted her calm response as either disrespect or confirmation that his accusations were accurate. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with the sergeant growing more agitated and Sarah remaining steadfastly unmoved. Finally, Thompson issued an ultimatum that would force Sarah to either comply with his demands or face serious disciplinary action. He ordered her to join the physical training immediately or report to the base commander's office to explain her insubordination. The choice he presented was clear: participate in the exercise or face potential dismissal from the military program. The weight of his words settled over the training ground like a heavy blanket, and everyone present understood that this moment would likely define Sarah's future in the service. The tension reached its peak as all eyes focused on Sarah, waiting to see how she would respond to this direct challenge to her authority and her claim of medical necessity. The desert wind picked up slightly, stirring the dust around their feet and adding an almost cinematic quality to the confrontation. Time seemed suspended as everyone waited for her next move, understanding that whatever happened next would have consequences that extended far beyond this single training session. Sarah looked directly into Sergeant Thompson's eyes, her gaze unwavering despite the intensity of his stare. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity, while dozens of soldiers watched from their positions around the training ground. The morning heat was beginning to build, and sweat beaded on the foreheads of those who had been exercising, but the confrontation between Sarah and the sergeant had brought all activity to a complete standstill. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that surprised everyone present, including Thompson himself. She informed the sergeant that her medical condition was not something she discussed lightly, and that it was documented in her military medical file. Her words were measured and professional, but there was an underlying strength that suggested she was prepared to stand her ground regardless of the consequences. The calm certainty in her voice caused several nearby soldiers to exchange glances. Sensing that there might be more to this situation than initially appeared, Thompson scoffed at her mention of medical documentation, suggesting that anyone could fabricate a convenient medical excuse to avoid difficult training. His skepticism was evident in every word as he challenged her to produce proof of this supposed condition. He had seen too many soldiers attempt to game the system with fraudulent medical claims, and he was convinced that Sarah was just another malingerer trying to avoid her responsibilities. His experience had taught him to trust his instincts about such matters, and everything about this situation screamed deception to him. The sergeant's doubt only seemed to strengthen Sarah's resolve. She explained that her condition was the result of injuries sustained during her previous deployment overseas. Injuries that had required extensive medical treatment and ongoing monitoring. Her mention of a previous deployment caused a stir among the watching soldiers, many of whom had assumed that Sarah was a fresh recruit with no combat experience. The revelation that she had already served in a war zone added a new dimension to the confrontation. Thompson's expression shifted slightly as he processed this information, but his skepticism remained firmly in place. He demanded to know why someone with combat injuries would be participating in basic training alongside new recruits. His question was valid from a procedural standpoint, as it was unusual for previously deployed soldiers to be placed in training programs designed for those just entering military service. Sarah's presence in their unit had puzzled many people, but until now, no one had been bold enough to ask for an explanation. Sarah's response revealed the complex circumstances that had brought her to this training program. She explained that her previous deployment had been cut short due to her injuries and that she was now working to return to full active duty status. The rehabilitation process had been long and difficult, requiring her to essentially start over in many aspects of her military training. Her current assignment to this unit was part of a carefully monitored program designed to help injured veterans return to service while ensuring their safety and the safety of their fellow soldiers. The explanation painted a very different picture of Sarah's motivations and circumstances than what Thompson had initially assumed. Rather than being a lazy recruit trying to avoid difficult training, she was revealed to be a decorated combat veteran working to overcome significant challenges in order to continue serving her country. The realization caused many of the watching soldiers to reassess their initial judgments about her character and commitment. However, Thompson remained unconvinced by Sarah's explanation. His years of experience had made him cynical about such claims, and he continued to believe that she was fabricating or exaggerating her condition to avoid physical demands. He pointed out that she appeared perfectly healthy and showed no obvious signs of injury or disability. His observation was technically accurate, as Sarah's injuries were not visible through her uniform, and she moved without any apparent difficulty or pain. The sergeant's continued skepticism prompted Sarah to make a decision that would change the entire dynamic of the confrontation. She asked Thompson if he truly wanted to see proof of her medical condition, making it clear that such proof would require her to reveal something very personal and potentially disturbing. Her question carried a gravity that caused the sergeant to pause, perhaps sensing for the first time that he might be treading on dangerous ground. Thompson's pride prevented him from backing down at this crucial moment. He loudly declared that he absolutely wanted to see proof of these supposed injuries, challenging Sarah to provide evidence that would justify her refusal to participate in training. His demand was delivered with the full authority of his rank and position, making it clear that he considered this a test of her honesty and integrity. The watching soldiers held their breath as they realized that this confrontation was about to take a dramatic turn. Sarah nodded slowly, accepting the sergeant's challenge with a resignation that suggested she had hoped to avoid this outcome, but was prepared for it nonetheless. She began to reach for the hem of her uniform shirt, her movements deliberate and careful. The significance of this action was not lost on anyone present, as they understood that she was about to reveal something that she had clearly preferred to keep private. The training ground fell completely silent as Sarah slowly lifted her shirt, turning slightly so that her back was visible to Thompson and the assembled soldiers. What they saw caused an immediate and profound reaction that rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The collective intake of breath was audible across the entire area as dozens of people simultaneously processed what Sarah had revealed. Her back was a devastating landscape of scars, telling a story of trauma and survival that no words could adequately convey. The marks crisscrossed her skin in irregular patterns, some raised and angry-looking despite the time that had obviously passed since the injuries occurred. The scars varied in size and depth, creating a patchwork of healed tissue that spoke to the severity of the original wounds. It was immediately clear to everyone present that these were not minor injuries or cosmetic blemishes, but the lasting evidence of a traumatic and life-threatening event. Among the scars, several observers could make out what appeared to be the distinctive marks left by shrapnel wounds. The irregular, jagged patterns were consistent with injuries caused by explosive devices, the kind of wounds that military medical personnel were all too familiar with in the current era of modern warfare. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, completely validating Sarah's claims about her medical condition and the circumstances that had brought her to this training program. Sergeant Thompson stood frozen in place, his mouth hanging open as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The confident certainty that had characterized his behavior throughout the confrontation evaporated in an instant, replaced by a growing awareness of the magnitude of his mistake. The woman he had been mocking and berating for the past several minutes was clearly a combat veteran who had sacrificed tremendously in service to her country. The scars on her back told a story of courage and survival that put his own military experience into perspective. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched for long moments as everyone present struggled to find appropriate words for the situation. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the sky, but the heat seemed less noticeable now as the weight of what had been revealed settled over the training ground. Several soldiers looked away out of respect for Sarah's privacy, while others continued to stare in amazement at the evidence of her sacrifice and survival. Thompson's face underwent a rapid transformation as the full implications of the situation became clear to him. The anger and frustration that had driven his behavior were quickly replaced by embarrassment and a growing sense of shame. He realized that he had publicly humiliated a combat veteran who had already given more for her country than many soldiers would ever be asked to sacrifice. The knowledge that his accusations and mockery had been delivered in front of dozens of witnesses only intensified his discomfort. Sarah slowly lowered her shirt and turned back to face Sergeant Thompson, her expression calm but tired. The emotional toll of revealing her scars in such a public setting was evident in her eyes, though she maintained the same composed demeanor that had characterized her behavior throughout the confrontation. The watching soldiers remained silent, many of them struggling to reconcile this new information with their previous assumptions about the quiet woman who had stood among them. Thompson found himself at a complete loss for words, a rare occurrence for someone who had built his reputation on his ability to command any situation through force of personality and voice. His mouth opened and closed several times as he searched for something appropriate to say, but the magnitude of his error seemed to have robbed him of his usual eloquence. The confident authority that had defined his interaction with Sarah had evaporated completely, leaving him looking smaller and more vulnerable than anyone had ever seen him. The story behind Sarah's scars began to emerge in fragments as she quietly explained the circumstances that had led to her injuries. She had been serving as a medic with a forward operating unit in Afghanistan when their convoy was attacked by insurgents using improvised explosive devices. The explosion that had caused her injuries had also killed 3 of her fellow soldiers and severely wounded several others. She had continued to provide medical care to her wounded comrades even after sustaining her own injuries, working to save lives while her own blood soaked through her uniform. The details of that day came slowly, delivered in Sarah's characteristically understated manner that somehow made them even more powerful. She described how the shrapnel from the explosion had torn through the rear of the vehicle where she had been positioned, sending hot metal fragments deep into her back and shoulders. The largest piece had missed her spine by less than an inch. And the military surgeons who had treated her injuries had marveled at how close she had come to permanent paralysis or death. Sarah's recovery had been long and arduous, involving multiple surgeries to remove shrapnel and repair damaged tissue. Some of the smaller metal fragments remained embedded in her back, too close to vital structures to be safely removed. These permanent reminders of that terrible day caused her chronic pain and limited her range of motion, making certain physical activities difficult or impossible. The medical restrictions that governed her participation in military training were not suggestions or conveniences, but necessary precautions to prevent further injury. The rehabilitation process had tested Sarah's resolve in ways that combat never had. Learning to live with chronic pain and physical limitations had been more challenging than facing enemy fire, requiring a different kind of courage and determination. There had been times when she had considered leaving the military entirely, accepting a medical discharge and trying to build a civilian life away from the service that had given her so much, but also taken so much away. However, Sarah's commitment to her fellow soldiers and her sense of duty had ultimately driven her decision to fight for her return to active service. She had endured months of physical therapy, psychological counseling, and medical evaluations in her determination to prove that she could still contribute meaningfully to military operations. The training program where she now found herself was the final step in that long journey back to full-duty status. Thompson's transformation in the wake of these revelations was dramatic and immediate. The sergeant who had spent the morning berating and mocking Sarah now found himself struggling with a profound sense of shame and regret. His experience and training had taught him to recognize courage and sacrifice when he saw them, and he was forced to confront the reality that he had attacked someone who embodied those qualities more completely than most soldiers he had ever encountered. The watching soldiers also underwent their own process of reassessment, as they absorbed the full implications of what they had witnessed. Many of them realized that they had made their own unfair judgments about Sarah based on her quiet demeanor and apparent reluctance to engage in certain activities. The revelation of her combat experience and the visible evidence of her sacrifices forced them to reconsider their assumptions about strength, courage, and dedication to service. Thompson's apology, when it finally came, was delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. The sergeant who had roared his accusations and challenges across the training ground now spoke with a humility that surprised everyone present, including himself. He acknowledged his mistake publicly and completely, making no attempt to justify or minimize his behavior. His words carried the weight of genuine remorse and a newfound respect for the woman he had so grievously misjudged. The impact of this confrontation extended far beyond the immediate participants, rippling through the entire military installation as word spread about what had transpired on the training ground. Sarah's story became a powerful reminder of the hidden sacrifices that many service members carry, and the importance of approaching fellow soldiers with respect and understanding rather than judgment and assumption. In the days and weeks that followed, Thompson made a conscious effort to learn from his mistake and change his approach to training and leadership. He began to emphasize the importance of understanding each soldier's unique circumstances and challenges, rather than applying a one-size-fits-all standard to everyone under his command. His experience with Sarah had taught him that true strength often came in forms that were not immediately visible or obvious. Sarah continued her rehabilitation program with the same quiet determination that had characterized her approach to everything else in her military career. The public revelation of her injuries had been difficult for her, as she had preferred to keep her struggles private, but she ultimately came to see it as an opportunity to educate others about the realities of combat service and recovery. Her example inspired other injured veterans to persevere in their own journeys back to active duty. The training program itself underwent subtle but significant changes as a result of the incident. Instructors were reminded of the importance of understanding their soldiers' medical histories and limitations before making assumptions about their capabilities or motivations. The emphasis shifted toward creating an environment where injured veterans could rehabilitate safely while still being challenged to reach their full potential. Sarah eventually completed her rehabilitation program and returned to active duty as a combat medic, serving with distinction in multiple deployments. Her experience with Sergeant Thompson became a defining moment in her military career, not because it represented a setback or obstacle, but because it demonstrated her ability to maintain her dignity and composure even in the face of unfair treatment. The scars on her back remained as permanent reminders of her sacrifice, but they also became symbols of her resilience and determination. The story of that morning on the training ground became part of military folklore at the base, passed down from one group of recruits to the next as a powerful lesson about the dangers of making assumptions about fellow service members. It served as a reminder that every soldier carried their own story of service and sacrifice, and that true leadership required the wisdom to look beyond surface appearances to understand the depth and complexity of human experience. Thompson never forgot the lesson he had learned that day, and he often shared Sarah's story with new instructors as an example of how quickly situations could be misjudged and how important it was to approach every soldier with respect and understanding. The incident had fundamentally changed his perspective on leadership and his approach to working with the men and women under his command. Years later, both Sarah and Thompson would reflect on that confrontation as a pivotal moment in their respective careers. For Sarah, it represented a test of her resolve and a demonstration that her service and sacrifice would be recognized and respected, even if that recognition sometimes came slowly. For Thompson, it was a humbling reminder that true leadership required empathy, understanding, and the wisdom to admit when one was wrong. The desert training ground where their confrontation had taken place remained unchanged, but the people who had been present that morning carried the memory of what they had witnessed and the lessons it had taught them. For the rest of their lives,